So now let's talk about Gog and Magog specifically. Shalom, everyone. Obviously, all of us are thinking very much about the great struggles that the Jewish people all over the world, and especially in Eretz Israel, are going through. Baruch Hashem, there's been some information that at least some hostages are going to be released, and all of our tefillot are that they all should come home b'shalom, full in body and spirit, and as well as our chayolim, we also pray for as well. But in addition to the general concern that we have over the milchama, many people are asking about how is this connected to the messianic process, and in particular, what is described in the book of Yechezkel as the wars of Gog and Magog. And are we experiencing those wars? What will be the outcome of those wars and the like? Now, it's important to kind of situate even Gog and Magog in a broader context. And the broader context of Gog and Magog is a concept that Chazal call Chavlei Mashiach, the birth pains of Mashiach. And the analogy is a very, very beautiful analogy. We know that obviously labor pains before childbirth can be excruciatingly painful, particularly in the pre-anesthesia days. And yet, out of that pain comes beautiful life. And therefore, Chazal are giving us some very sobering advice, sobering information, that before Mashiach comes and brings peace into the world and holiness into the world, and the restoration of the Beit HaMikdash and the restoration of prophecy, there will be a birth process. And that birth process may involve a tremendous amount of pain. And we will sometimes lose hope, and we will sometimes be despondent. When will this pain end? But the message is that the messianic pain, the pains before Mashiach, are exactly like the labor pains. They will culminate in birth, they will culminate in goodness. And that doesn't mean there aren't going to be sacrifices. Unfortunately, throughout Jewish history, there have been sacrifices, and unfortunately, there continue to be sacrifices. And we need Hashem's rachamim, we need Hashem's mercy, Hashem's compassion, and we try to strengthen ourselves through Torah and Tefillah, and particularly Avat Yisrael, caring about each other, loving one another. But at the end of the day, whether the sacrifices be many, or as we certainly hope that they be very, very minimal, there will be birth, there will be Mashiach. Can't give up. Am Yisrael Chai. The Jewish people will live. God's love for the Jewish people will never be affected. So essentially, Gog and Magog is a chelek, is a portion of a larger process that's called Chavlei Mashiach. And within that larger process of Chavlei Mashiach, we fold in the Holocaust, we fold in pogroms, we fold in the Crusades, meaning all of these were developmental stages in ways that we can't exactly pinpoint towards the Messianic process. The establishment of the State of Israel itself in the aftermath of the Holocaust in 1948. Many consider that to be, again, it's a bit controversial, and this may not be the time to go into that, but many consider the Hakamat HaMedina itself as Reishit Smichat Kulatenu, the beginning of the redemptive process. But even those who wouldn't characterize it that way did say it is part of the Messianic Chavlei Mashiach as it unfolds in that way. The return of the Jewish people to Eretz Israel, whether you're a Zionist or not a Zionist, you have to acknowledge millions and millions of Jews have come to Eretz Israel, and that itself is a sign of Geula. So the point is, Gog and Magog does have a specific context, which I will talk about, but you need to also locate it as part of a larger scheme of things, the scheme of Chavlei Mashiach. And before I get to Gog and Magog b'diyuk, I want to mention another metaphor that Chazal use. Metaphor number one is Chavlei Mashiach. Metaphor number two is Mashiach is called a tzemach. This is actually from Tanakh itself. Tzemach is a shoot, a growth, a plant. Every day we say in our tefillot, Et tzemach David avdecha mehirat tatzmiach. May Hashem cause to flower or to grow the plant or the shoot of David. One of the names of Mashiach, ben David, is Semach Shemo. His name is Semach, that which grows. Why would Mashiach be referred to as Semach? And why would Geula be called Semicha? Even in the prayer L'Shlom HaMedina, Reishit Semichat Geulatenu, the beginning of the growth, of the shoot of our redemption. So the Maharal of Prague offers a very beautiful insight. If you plant a seed, you will notice that before the seed germinates and begins to produce a plant, it first disintegrates into the ground. It actually kind of totally disintegrates. And then you get a plant. And that suggests, says the Maharal, that in order for Mashiach to come, we have to obliterate our egotism, our arrogance, our hubris, our sense that we are in control of our fate. The idea that the Torah talks about, that people say, Kochi v'yotzem yadi, it is my strength and my power that has achieved all of my success. As long as we are arrogant, as long as we attribute all of our successes to our skill and our wisdom and our prowess and our might, God will not yet redeem himself. He will redeem himself when we recognize that in many, many ways we are powerless, we are helpless, and as the Mishnah says in Sota, Ein lanu lihisha'en ela al Avinu shebashamayim, we have no one to rely upon except for HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Shemayim. And seen in that light, I think we've discovered over the past few years that indeed we are not totally in control of our fate, that without HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we are in big, big trouble. I can go back to COVID. And indeed, some actually describe Gog and Magog as a plague. I'll get back to that. In which, with all of our science and all of our technology, a little virus could shut down the world for more than 2 years. And we discovered it even in the October 7 pogrom, the October 7 massacre of Shmini Atzeret Simchat Torah, in which more than 1,000 Jews, men, women, little babies, children, were mercilessly slaughtered by the barbarians of Hamas. And again, this is not the time to enter into a critique, but people were very, very surprised at the massive intelligence failure. Everyone knows Israeli military intelligence is by far the best in the world. The United States takes a lot of lessons from Israeli security. And how could we be caught off guard? And obviously it's a subject of controversy. It's a subject of investigation. But part of the lesson is that, yeah, we have the greatest army in the world and we are eternally grateful. And I will say this over and over again to the Chayalim of the IDF, who every single day put their lives on the line for the protection of OUisrael and the Medina. So there's no question of our gratitude to the Chayalim, our gratitude to the State of Israel for all that it's done for the Jewish people. But we have to learn that we're not totally in control here, that with the greatest army in the world and the greatest intelligence in the world, without HaKadosh Baruch Hu, anything can happen. And in some ways, as devastating as this is, one might once again see a certain messianic symbolism in the tzmicha, that when our ego disintegrates and we realize we're not in charge, and we realize it's not kochi v'yotzem yadi, and we realize ein lanu lihisha'en ela al Avinu shebashamayim, there's no one we can rely upon except God, that paves the road for the revelation of the messianic redemption. So in a sense, precisely out of the darkness comes the light. The darkness itself, the old saying that the night is darkest before the dawn applies here as well. It's precisely when we realize our helplessness that wonderful things can happen. And I would extend this not only referring to our situation in Eretz Yisrael, which is, of course, the foremost issue in our minds, but even in terms of the resurgence of anti-Semitism throughout the world. I mean, it's quite amazing. People often ask me, is it safe to come to Israel? Is it safe to live in Israel? I say, well, is it safe to live in New York or Pittsburgh or California? The world is a dangerous place. When I read about college students having to hide in a back room of a library in Cooper Union or Columbia University or MIT, I mean, it sounds like the Holocaust, in the sense that, you have to hide from the enemy and the like. But once again, what is going on here is that God is sending us a message that there's really nobody we can rely upon. It's only God, meaning, this nation, that nation, this government will stay with us up to a certain degree, and we appreciate that as well. But ultimately, without HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's nothing that we're going to accomplish. And this is the metaphor of tzmicha. The seed has to disintegrate before it produces the tzemach. So these are the two metaphors to keep in mind: the chavlei Mashiach idea, the pain, and the idea of tzmicha, the obliteration of egotism, and kochi v'yotzim yodi. So now let's talk about Gog and Magog specifically. Gog and Magog is actually described in Yecheskel, the Navi Yecheskel, in Perek Lamed Ches and Lamed Tes. Some portions of that are actually read as Haftorot. One is Haftorah of Pesach, during Pesach and the like. And let me just first straighten out a very common misconception. It is not the war of Gog versus Magog. These are not the two sides of the war, but rather Gog is described as the Melech of Magog. Now that doesn't necessarily give you any particular clear identification, but Gog, Melech Magog, he is described as coming from the north, Yarkatsei, Tzafon, and it is described in the book of Yecheskel that there will be a great confederation of other nations under the banner of Gog, the king of Magog, and this will be against Yerushalayim. And there will be a wondrous defeat. And the nations of Gog and Magog, Melech Magog, and all of the nations with him will be defeated, and God will establish his dwelling place in Yerushalayim once again. It mentions great casualties, but in Yecheskel at least, the casualties are described as the casualties of the enemies of the Jewish people. Now, there is a tradition, although it's not in the text itself, that the wars of Gog and Magog will be around Sukkot time. And that is why the Haftarot of Sukkot focus on Gog and Magog. Once again, something to think about, because the massacre of October 7 was in fact not Sukkot, but Shmini Atzeret, which is essentially the appendage to Sukkot. So at least in terms of timing, it does fit the Gog and Magog paradigm, but I think you'll have a little bit of a problem because of Yarkatsei Tzafon. Now, the idea that Gog and Magog come from the north raises many questions as to what their identification is. A tradition going back to the Vilna Gaon actually connects it to Russia and Ukraine, and this goes back more than 250 years ago. Now, so far, we have not yet seen a connection between Russia, Ukraine, and Hamas down here. But who knows? As we know, Putin has already issued different statements against Israel. I need to make a point that the Rambam makes. The Rambam actually says we shouldn't be too involved in trying to interpret the specifics of Gog and Magog in terms of current events, simply because we just don't know. This is one of those things that you only know in hindsight. When Mashiach comes, I will then be able to go backwards and understand how each event fits into the Messianic process. Until Mashiach comes, we're essentially wandering around in the dark. So I'm going to mention just a few thoughts just so people can connect it a little bit. But obviously, I am not a Navi. We don't have Nevuah. Our sages tell us that today, anyone who claims to be a Navi is either an idiot, insane, or a child. So everything we know is everything we say is simply a thought, a speculation, a guess. But this is Gog and Magog. Now, there is a second description of the wars of Gog and Magog in Zechariah, the Navi Zechariah, Perek Yud Gimel, Perek Yud Dalet. Now, it is interesting that in order to just look at the Tanakh's coverage of Gog and Magog, you therefore have to read Yecheskel, Lamed Ches, Lamed Tes, and then Zechariah, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalet. What's interesting, though, is the words Gog and Magog are only mentioned in Yecheskel. Zechariah does not use the terminology of Gog and Magog, but it's virtually universal among all the commentators that the wars that Zechariah is talking about are the same as the Gog and Magog struggles of Yechezkel. And Zechariah adds a number of details. Zechariah adds the idea that Yerushalayim will be split. Now, maybe that happened back in 1948, that half of the city will run away, half of the city will remain. We hope that already happened, because otherwise the connotation would be it would happen again now. But again, it could have already happened. In other words, we hope that perhaps that aspect already happened. There's also a reference, which needs some interpretation, that there will be Jews who will be attacking Yerushalayim. What does it mean? There'll be Jewish people attacking Yerushalayim? How could that be? Again, I don't want to get too political, but we do have Jewish people and Jewish organizations that have attacked Eretz Israel and the state of Israel in its time of adversity, and that indeed don't even recognize the legitimacy of the Jewish presence in Jerusalem. I don't want to get into name calling. We can call them self-hating Jews or whatever the issue is. But the Metziut is very, very clear that the statement, there will be Jews fighting against Jerusalem, is a statement that actually has a contemporary relevance. Zechariah also mentions a very interesting detail. Zechariah talks about a great funeral that will take place in Jerusalem, in which the women will weep and the men will weep. And by the way, the Gemara in Sukkah says, this is the halachic makor, the halachic source for mechitza bebeit knesset, because the implication is the women are separated from the men, and the Gemara makes a kal v'chomer, an a fortiori reasoning, if at a time of a funeral, when there's less of a risk of improper levity, there should be a separation, kal v'chomer, during the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the celebration of Sukkot, and even in the Beit Knesset. And this is a great funeral of great mourning, but it doesn't really say who died. Chazal say in Maseches Sukkah that this will be the death of Mashiach ben Yosef. This is a very mysterious idea. All of us know that the ultimate Redeemer, who will rebuild the Beis HaMikdash and will gather the rest of the Jews back to the land of Israel, is Mashiach, the Anointed One, the descendant of David, Mashiach ben David. But Chazal posit there will be an earlier messianic figure, or maybe pre-messianic figure, who will be Mashiach ben Yosef from the tribe of Ephraim, and Mashiach ben Yosef will be involved in the war of Gog and Magog, and he will defeat those enemies, but tragically, he will die in that process. And that is the great levaya, the great funeral that is being described in the book of Zechariah, the death of Mashiach ben Yosef. Now, exactly how does that work? Does Mashiach ben Yosef reveal himself? Or is he an unknown person, a person who dies in these milchamot? Perhaps he's a chayal of the IDF who gave his life. Maybe that was Mashiach ben Yosef. In other words, there's so much we don't know. Mashiach ben Yosef may not necessarily be an open revelation. On the other hand, Zechariah talks about public mourning, but maybe it's the public mourning for chayalim, one of whom might have been Mashiach ben Yosef. Again, I'm just throwing things out. I'm just telling you the psukim, because a lot of people don't read Tanakh. I mean, a lot of people here talk about Gog and Magog. They don't look at what the psukim actually say, and then try to think what they might mean. A final point about Gog and Magog is that it does mention there will be Jews fighting against Jews. It does mention Yerushalayim will be severed. And again, as I say, perhaps Bezrat Hashem, that already had happened, so that's off the table right now. It does mention tremendous suffering that the Jewish people will go through, which is not mentioned in Yechezkel. But Zechariah does mention the eventual victory of Am Yisrael and the eventual Mashiach ben David that will come. So collectively, this is the brief description of Gog and Magog. Now, the Vilna Gaon makes two very interesting points about Milchemes Gog and Magog. One is scary and one is comforting. The scary one is that the war of Gog and Magog will only last for 12 minutes. Now, for 250 years, no one understood what type of war could be over in 12 minutes. Unfortunately, over the past 70 years, we now understand what type of war could be over in 12 minutes, and that would be a nuclear war, which means the Vilna Gaon was predicting, amazingly with Ruach HaKodesh, that Milchemes Gog and Magog could potentially involve nuclear weapons. And that is not a totally impossible assumption. As we know, Iran, which is so much involved, and Iran is also to the north. They might, in fact, they're not far north, but they might be north enough to qualify as Gog, Melech, Magog. Certainly has the will and the capacity to use nuclear weapons at the point that they so choose. And as they say, that type of conflict would tend to be over pretty quickly. That's comment number one. And to bring a little proof to the Vilna Gaon, which again, not that I enjoy doing this, when the Navi Zechariah describes the Gog and Magog war, although without using the words Gog and Magog, he describes people's flesh, people's skin melting on their faces. That's a description. Once again, that does not correspond to any conventional warfare that we have. That does correspond to the things that happen in nuclear holocaust and the like. So that is comment number one, which is really, really frightening, very, very scary. But then the Vilna Gaon said a comment number two. There is a general rule in biblical prophecies that all negative prophecies can be canceled or modified or terminated. Meaning, when we test a Navi, if he's a Navi Sheker, a true prophet, or a false prophet, so the only way a Navi can be discredited is if he prophesied something good would happen, and it doesn't, that's a proof he's a liar. But if he prophesied something bad would happen, and it didn't, now that doesn't prove he's a Navi Emet, but it doesn't prove he's a Navi Sheker, he's given another chance, because even if he's a true prophet, God has compassion, God has mercy. And Nivuot Lera'ah can always be terminated. In fact, that's the story of Yonah, right? Yonah was given a prophecy to go to Nineveh. In 40 days, you're going to be destroyed. That was an unconditional prophecy. There were no conditions attached. And yet, the people of Nineveh, the non-Jews of Nineveh, did Shuvah, and God forgave them, right? We read the book of Yonah on Yom Kippur. So says the Vilna Gaon, the same thing is true with the prophecies of Chavlei Mashiach and Gog and Magog. Yeah, in a worst case scenario, all of these bad things can happen and happen and happen and happen. But we can avert them, we can terminate them. Even the death of Mashiach ben Yosef, says the Vilna Gaon, can be averted by tshuva, by tefillah, by rachamim, and the like. So, in a sense, we're in the middle of Chavlei Mashiach right now, but that doesn't mean we can't change course. That doesn't mean things can't get better. That doesn't mean things can't be mitigated. And therefore, it's very, very important to focus our minds on tefillot and on shuvah. And I have to say this, it's inescapable. We don't even remember this anymore. But if you think about the whole year before October 7th, last year, the whole year, the state of Israel, the Jewish people, were being torn apart by dissension, by machloket, by sinat chinam, whether it was the demonstrations against judicial reform, or whether it was the demonstrations against the draft of Bnei Yeshiva. So religious people were demonstrating, sometimes in not a proper way. Secular people were tearing down mechitzot in Tel Aviv on Yom Kippur. I'm not here to blame any particular segment. Unfortunately, there is cheshbon hanefesh on all sides of the equation. And people were saying that the fabric of a democratic society in Israel is being ripped apart. Israel will not, if you remember, Israel will not survive. These things seem so trivial in light of what we're facing. But these were big, big, big issues a few months ago. And there were reservists who were saying, Miluim, who were saying, we're not going to report to military duty in protest. And some have said that emboldened Hamas and the enemy, if they were getting the message that Chayalim were not going to respond. Now, Baruch Hashem, they all did respond, but if they got the message they were not going to respond, that may have emboldened them. So if there is a silver cloud in this dark period, if there is or within the choshech, I have to say that one of the great and wonderful things that have happened out of this horrendous situation is that Jews are coming together. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. You know, Hamas didn't care if you wore a black kippah or a knitted kippah or no kippah at all. And to some degree, we Jews are learning to care less about that, to reach out, to make connections, in which the religious are connecting to the secular are connecting to the religious. And indeed, even among the secular, there are thousands of chayolim, tens of thousands, who want tzitzit, who want that sign of connection to God. In America, I know, there are totally secular college students who are now coming to Chabad houses for Shabbat or other organizations for Shabbat, not because they want to be religious necessarily, but because they say, I see now that this is my home. I see now I want to be connected to Jews. I want to be part of the Jewish people. And that's a wonderful thing, because there's a famous thought from Rav Kook, that if the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of sinat chinam, hatred and polarization, it'll only be rebuilt when there's avat chinam, when there's this complete love that we have for each other. And I think we're beginning to see it. And to me, that itself is a messianic sign, that we're undoing the cause of the Churban, and that brings the Binyan Beit HaMikdash and the Geulah. My big fear is that when this war passes, and may it pass very, very soon, we'll simply go back to business as usual and simply resume the normal pattern of machloket, sinat chinam. And that would be a tragedy, because it's one thing to go through a tragedy and learn from it, and there's another thing to go through from a tragedy and not learn from it. That makes it a tragedy on top of a tragedy. And that we have to be very much careful about. Now, one final point. There is a parallel development that one has to consider, that some people make it part of Gog and Magog, and some people consider it a separate parallel phenomenon. And that is what is often called Galut Yishmael. In Chazal's typology, based on their interpretation of Sefer Daniel, there are 4 exiles the Jewish people go through from the time we came to Eretz Yisrael. We're not counting Mitzrayim, that's pre-Eretz Yisrael. But once we're in Eretz Yisrael, we have the Galut of Bavel, the Babylonian exile that destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. We have the Galus of Persia, then the Galus of Greece, the Hanukkah story, and the Galut of Rome. Rome destroyed, the Roman Empire is of course gone, but Rome destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, Hasheni, the second Beit HaMikdash, in the year 70, 68 or 70. And even though there's no Roman Empire, we are still in Galut Edom to this very day. Number one, because the Beit HaMikdash they destroyed is not built. Number two, Rome morphed into Western civilization generally. And number three, Rome morphed into the Christianity, the Catholic Church, and most Jews in the world are kind of under the domination of Christianity. So Chazal saw Galut Edom as the final stage of the Galut before the Mashiach, acknowledging it would last a very long time. However, we find in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, and this was developed by Rav Chaim Vital, the Ari's great disciple, that at the tail end of Galut Edom, there will be a Galut Yishmael, that the Arab world, the Arabs we believe are descended from Yishmael, and therefore the Arab ascendancy in the world. Now again, we are still in Galut Edom because most Jews are not under Islamic rule. Right? American Jews are not under Islamic rule. Israeli Jews are not under Islamic rule. So we are in Galut Edom, that's the Galut, but we will be persecuted by Yishmael in a very, very, very intense way. So Yishmael is like version 1.2 of Galut Edom. And Rav Chaim Vital says it will be the most difficult because Yishmael has certain spiritual merits that Esav, right, Edom is connected to Esav, doesn't have. Yishmael has the merit of circumcision because Yishmael was commanded to do a brit. Avram was commanded to circumcise Yishmael. Yishmael has virtues of tzniut. Yishmael has virtues of tefillah. Now, it is very difficult, and I can't fully explain, why would God listen to the prayers of those who are intending to do evil in the world? But apparently, there is a principle of dark spiritual energy. Yishmael can only be defeated by spiritual work. And Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer notes that Yisrael and Yishmael are the only two nations that have God's name imprinted in their very identity. And that is why Yishmael is such a difficult enemy to defeat, because Yishmael comes into the battlefront, so to speak, with a certain measure of zechuyot, and therefore we have to counter that. Now, let me point out that don't confuse Muslim and Arab. There are, of course, Muslim Arabs, most, and there are Christian Arabs. All Arabs, we believe, are descended from Yishmael. Now, Iran is Muslim but not Arab, so Iran is not Yishmael. Iran is actually connected to Paras, Persia. So here the Maral says that in this Galut Yishmael, there will be an unhealthy collaboration between Paras and Yishmael, which will try to be machriv the world. Wow. Paras and Yishmael. Iran and the Arab nations. Iran and Hamas. Everybody knows, I don't even think it's an open secret, I think it's just an open fact, that the financing of Hamas and Hezbollah is totally from Iran, and that is mamash, the partnership, the unholy alliance that could be machriv the world between Paras and Yishmael, which is adding a measure of danger in the Galut Yishmael, which is part of Galut Edom, before the Mashiach comes. But one other idea, because one problem is that Chazal give us so many perspectives, some of which are contradictory, but we can fit it into modern life. There is a medrash that is in the Yalkut Shimoni, in Yeshayahu Perek Samach, which actually talks about it in the opposite way. Instead of talking about an alliance between Paras and Yishmael, it actually says, B'acharit hayamim, Paras, Melech Paras, will wage war against Melech Arabia. Melech Paras will wage war against the king of Arabia, and Paras will be machriv chatzi ha'olam, half of the world. Now, what is the war between Paras and Arabia? Well, once again, many people have speculated. Again, I have to say that everything I say is just something to think about. It's not anything definitive. That one of the motivations that Paras had, that Hamas had, was that as part of the Abrahamic Accords that brought in the Emirates, brought in Dubai, having a relationship with Israel, Saudi Arabia was reputedly on the verge of also a similar Abrahamic Accord. And Hamas, or Iran actually, was determined to derail that by starting this war, which kind of took the Abrahamic Accords off the table because of Arab unity and the like. So what is that? A war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because that was actually the precipitating cause. So it's fascinating, the more you think about this, the more you see all sorts of signs, all sorts of portents. But I do want to say the final message is that we know that Yishmael, as a person, did tshuva before he died. And that's why he honored Yitzchak in burying Avram. He gave Yitzchak a kedima. So Chazal tell us that just as Yishmael the person did tshuva before he died, Yishmael the nations will do tshuva. B'acharit hayamim. You might look at the Abrahamic Accords as part of a tshuva process. And that, Emir Hashem, will continue. the point is, the fact that side by side you have Hamas and you have other Arabs that are hostile, that's not a contradiction, because once again, it's a process. And I think, in a positive way, to end with possibly good news, we are seeing in some corners of the Arab world, relatively small, the movements and the overtures towards tshuva, and perhaps, Be'ezrat Hashem, things might change further and further in a very, very good direction. Just to end, however, with the Rambam's warning that we shouldn't be too fixated in trying to read current events in Gog and Magog. The most important thing for us is to focus our attention on doing good things. You know, it's very hard for us to see the cause and effect of our mitzvot. You know, if I have a gun and I shoot a terrorist, we see that my bullet goes into the terrorist and takes him out of commission. When I sit and I daven, I say Tehillim, I give tzedakah, I do acts of loving kindness, I learn Torah. It's hard for me to see exactly what is being accomplished. How am I helping the people in Gaza? But, you know, in ways we don't always understand. It could be the chesed you did today saved somebody's life. It could be the chesed you did today will allow the IDF to free somebody in captivity. We just don't know how it works. But if a person is a ma'amin in Hashem and His Torah, we know that it makes a difference. So we got to tell ourselves constantly that we do have the ability to make things better. And if we have that ability to bring Rachamim into the world, we have the responsibility to do so. So my bracha is, may Klal Yisrael, and really the whole world, but especially Klal Yisrael, see peace. May our chayalim be protected. May all of the hostages come home. And may no person suffer anymore. And may all of this be a precursor to bring the Geula Shlema, the Mashiach, the Beis HaMikdash, peace in the world. B'mheira v'yameinu. Amen.